The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, see everything we do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air Magazine. Thanks for being here today. We're here every day at 3 p.m. to give you videos to inspire you, uplift you, and teach you about art. Today we have one called Creating Dynamic Landscapes. It's literally one of the best-selling we've ever done with the great John MacDonald. And I thought it would be a terrific video for Christmas Eve.
Hi, my name is John MacDonald. I'm delighted to be here showing you my painting process. I hope you find it beneficial, informative, and perhaps even mildly entertaining. The painting process I used has really evolved over the last 20 years, as much by accident as intent. None of it's original. It goes back a couple centuries. I've borrowed things from other artists, read from books. It's a process that's fairly common. But it works for me, and that's the reason I use it. It works for me. That's all it means. This is not the best way to paint. It's not the only way to paint, but it's the best way to paint for me. I am not going to be offering you any secrets, any special techniques known only the chosen few, any secret formulas that'll make your paintings glow like a Vermeer. I'm a firm believer in the basics, and I think that you will find that your painting will improve the more you can focus on and master and come to a deeper understanding of the basics. Composition, value, color, edges, etc. It's all about the basics. So I'm going to be offering you a few concepts now briefly, and then I'll show them to you while I'm painting and getting into the demo. But you are going to have to try them to find out if they really work for you. Painting is not a spectator sport. We can't sit back and just watch and listen or look. Yes, we can learn a lot from books. We can learn a lot from magazines, attending conventions, attending workshops, and talking to other artists. But ultimately, we learn to paint by painting. It's the only way we can really learn. I am going to be using photographs in my painting process, and so let me just address for a minute the pros and cons of photos, because I know there's some controversy of this in the painting world. I think the greatest advantage of using a photograph in the studio as painting reference is that it gives us time. We have time to study the image, study the composition, cut and paste different pieces of the landscape to enhance our composition. We have time to study the value structure, that 2 to 5 major values that express the composition. We have time to really study color relationships, even if those color relationships aren't quite captured very well by the camera. We have the luxury of time, so we can spend the time on the important things first and create from the very beginning a painting that is working step by step by step. It also can capture ephemeral weather conditions that you would never be able to capture plein air. Sometimes you'll see a beautiful sunset scene, a dusk, a sunrise, certain storm conditions, a fleeting effect of water on light. Something that really reaches you and immediately you want to paint it. You only have 5 minutes at most. There are some conditions and situations in a landscape that you simply cannot paint plein air. Having a camera with you can allow you at least to record some of that to help you trigger your memory to allow you to paint from it. In terms of the quality of the visual information that a camera captures, as long as you take multiple exposures of the landscape, it often will give adequate information about value relationships. That's not a bad thing to have since it's so important in a painting. It also, of course, captures way too much detail. It captures all the detail we could possibly need. So those three advantages: it gives us time to work in the studio, it can capture ephemeral conditions in the landscape, and it can capture, I think, adequate value information if shot properly. The disadvantages, well, there are several. The biggest disadvantage is color. A digital camera cannot possibly capture the nuanced, sophisticated color that the human eye can see, especially in water, in skies, clouds. In fact, name any element in the landscape and you will find that a camera simplifies the color and often will shift the hue of the color. So what was, say, take a field of snow in the evening, at dusk. To the human eye, that snow may look as to be a purplish gray with tints of pink and green. And you go home all excited and you download the photograph and it turns out to be a solid sheet of bright cobalt blue. The camera just cannot capture color. The camera also will often exaggerate contrasts. If you shoot just one photograph and don't take multiple exposures, you're bound to end up with a photograph with either a white sky or black shadows. There are no white skies or black shadows in nature. So color contrast is a real problem. I think the single greatest disadvantage with a photograph is that it is a frozen and soulless and mechanical record of what we see. It does not capture movement in the landscape. It does not capture the movement of clouds, the movement of water, the movement of wind blowing across a meadow. All of those are part of the life of the landscape and affect our memory of it, which will affect how we paint it. The camera can't capture that. But even more so, it simply can't capture the life of the scene. And when you're painting plein air, on location, you're not just painting what you see. You are living in that landscape at that moment. You're a part of that landscape, and you're as much a part of that landscape as the tree or the cloud that you're painting. I believe that affects us on an emotional level that will allow us to paint from a deeper spot within us and create a mood perhaps or effects on the canvas that at least evoke those feelings that we had. The camera cannot capture our emotions, and often when we're on a landscape, it is the emotional reaction that first attracts us to the landscape. Lastly, let me just talk about copying versus creating. I think those who are most against using photos in the studio for photographic reference, they are against copying photos, and I am absolutely in agreement with that. There is no better way to kill your painting than to simply take a photograph and copy it color for color, detail for detail, value for value, because they're inaccurate. And the camera simply sees in a way that the human eye does not. A photograph is a copy of a scene, and to copy a photograph is to make a copy of a copy, and we all know how inadequate those can be. You are a painter, you're not a news reporter, so you're not interested in just facts. We're not making a copy, we're making a painting, and that's a vastly different thing. If I have a copy of a photograph next to my easel, and that's all I'm doing is copying that photograph, my focus is there. My mind is on the photograph primarily, and the painting canvas second. I need to focus on this. We're creating a painting. We're not copying a photograph. So what is a painting? Well, a painting is a construction. It has parts and it has a process. And different artists have different lists of the parts of a painting. I tend to see 5, some see 4, some see 6. We all agree on the essentials. A painting consists of a composition, a value structure. Now, the composition are the shapes, the 4 to 5 essential shapes of the landscape, how they fit together. You want to tie it into a whole that's both interesting, but it has variety. Usually we represent that as outlines. Well, the value structure is those shapes assigned a value being not a monetary value, but I'm talking about lights and darks. So a light sky, a dark band of trees in the distance, and a mid-value field, that would be the value structure of a landscape. So the components of a painting, again, are composition, the value structure, color, more specifically color relationships, edges, An edge is where two forms in the landscape meet. Say you have a hill against the sky. Is that line where the hill meets the sky going to be soft or razor sharp? So we have edges, edge contrasts, and lastly details. And we all know what details are. Those tiny little marks that can signify a flower in the foreground or a cow in the middle ground or a building in the far distance. Composition, value structure, color, edges, and details. The critical point is that these 5 components of a painting are not equal. There is a hierarchy of importance. Think of a painting as a pyramid that consists of several components: composition, values, and in this case, really value structure, color, edges, and details. The composition is the base of the pyramid. It provides the foundation, the strength of the entire structure. If the composition doesn't work, the pyramid comes crumbling down. If the composition of your painting does not work, the painting will not work. No matter how beautifully you handle color or draw all those little details or handle the edges or the values, the composition of the painting is the most important component. It's what we usually see first in a painting, and it's usually what we remember of the painting. Second of importance is the value structure. And the value structure, again, are those 2 to 5 major value shapes. They are the shapes of the composition, but assigned a light or a dark. Why is that important? Well, the composition just in line is not adequate. We really cannot judge a composition until we have values assigned to it. So composition, value structure. Colors are number 3. Colors are sexy, they're seductive. We often love to go into work with a landscape painting first by working with color relationships, but they're not as important as the composition nor the value structure. Lastly are the edges, where those 2 edges will meet. Is it soft edge? Is it a hard edge? And then finally, details. The problem is that many beginners are so seduced by details and color, they want to start the painting this way. You cannot build the pyramid on its point. It will come crashing down. So when you begin your painting, it's important then to focus first on the composition, value structure, color, edges, and then details. And if there is the hierarchy, why not design your painting process around that hierarchy? And that's the process that I use. Again, this isn't original. It's a very traditional process. There are approximately 7 steps in my painting process. Again, none of this is original. It's fairly traditional. The first 3 of which don't even involve touching a brush. I choose the scene and I ask a critical question. What is it about this scene that most attracts me and makes me want to paint it? I choose a scene, I gather information, and that can be multiple photographs with multiple exposures, sketches, tonal studies, or even a plein air study. I go back to the studio and I'll edit that information, changing some of the sketches perhaps, editing some of the photos. With that information in hand, I'm ready to begin painting. I'll compose the scene, then create a monochromatic underpainting, which is essentially creating the value structure of the painting. When that is dry, it's usually a day or 2, sometimes 3, then I will layer in color on the painting, all the while manipulating the edges and then finishing usually with some well-chosen details. So that's the process. Choose a scene, gather information, edit that information, compose the scene, paint in an underpainting, establish the value structure, and then work in color, edges, and ending with details. So let's take a look at my materials. Currently, I'm using a limited palette. I initially was using Prussian blue, cad red oak pale, and permanent alizarin crimson. I've since added a few more. I have found the limited palette to be extremely beneficial in color mixing. I'll go into that a little bit later when we talk about color. Okay, the white I use is a mixture of titanium and zinc. This happens to be Gamblin. It's a 50-50 mixture. It's a very nice white to use and often considered to be the best substitute for lead white. The reason for the mixture: titanium is very opaque, forms a very hard paint film, and dries quickly. The zinc is slightly translucent, but dries with a very brittle paint film. It can crack and dries more slowly. Titanium is great, but because it's so opaque, in high key mixtures, the colors can look a little chalky, which is why I like the zinc added into it. I occasionally will add an alkyd white if I'm painting plein air, but in this case I'm going to be in the studio, so I'll use just the 50-50 mix. The yellow I use is a cadmium yellow light pure or cadmium yellow light pale, also works. Almost any brand will do. I like it because it seems to be it seems to be in the middle between the warm and cool whites. It's warmer than a lemon yellow, but cooler than a cad yellow medium. The blue I use is a Prussian blue. This happens to be Winsor & Newton. Any brand will do. And again, I like Prussian because it's neither warm like an ultramarine blue or cool like a cerulean or a turquoise blue. The red I'm using is a permanent alizarin crimson. If you like alizarin crimson and use it, it's important to buy one that is permanent. Traditional alizarin crimson is not light fast, and you should not use it. Now, with just those 4 colors, I can mix a very nice purple, but I found myself mixing purple so often that I began just using dioxazine purple, just strictly to save time. It's a translucent color, which I like quite a bit. And with these 4 colors, it is possible to approximate earth tones, but I say approximate. It took a long time to mix something that looked like an umber or a sienna. So just to save time, I found myself using a raw umber. This is Vasari brand. I've tried a lot of other brands of raw umber, but I prefer Vasari because it seems to be slightly less yellowish. And when mixed with a white, it forms a beautiful silver gray that forms the basis for most of my neutrals. For the underpainting, which I'll be doing today, I use burnt umber and burnt sienna. Often you can use burnt sienna straight, but because it simply doesn't give you any deep darks. If you have a painting where there are some extremely deep shadows, you might want to mix a little burnt umber with it. I'll talk more about this when I actually start the underpainting. As far as my medium goes, I use a medium that's essentially a retouch varnish. It's 1 part safflower oil, 1 part linseed oil, 1/2 part stand oil, 1/2 part Dorland wax, and a little bit of cobalt dryer. If you fill a peanut butter jar or old salsa jar, I would end up putting in about 1/8 of a teaspoon of dryer. I add the wax because without the wax, it's all oils: stand oil, linseed oil, safflower oil. It dries to a very glossy finish. It's very difficult to photograph the paintings and sometimes even to view the paintings if there's bright ambient light. I like the look of the painting after it dries with a little bit of wax in it. It's more of a satin finish, and yet the colors are just as rich. This tube, I'm holding a tube of the medium. I filled this tube. When I travel, I just take a tube with me rather than a jar in the studio. For my brushes, I use 2 kinds. I use a flat that's a bristle synthetic blend. This is a brush from Utrecht that is sadly no longer made. I bought most of their remaining stock. But frankly, any moderately priced bristle synthetic blend brush will do fine. I'm very hard on my brushes. I scumble a lot and I wear them out quickly, which is why I don't buy expensive brushes. I start a painting, block in a painting, and do most of my painting with these brushes, the bristle synthetic blend flat. But toward the end of the painting, when I'm looking for a little more brushy effect, or if I need to cut a really sharp edge, I use a Robert Simmons titanium. It's a synthetic brush, softer, and holds a nice edge. It allows me to lay paint into the painting, and I paint rather thinly, but it allows me to paint into that layer without picking it up, which is what bristles would often do. I also have a large brush that I will often drag across a painting if I feel that the edges are too sharp in the process of painting and need to soften it. I am moving towards a non-toxic studio, so I do not use terps. When I need to thin the paints, I use a mixture of 50% safflower oil, 50% linseed oil. Like titanium, linseed oil dries more quickly with a very strong paint film, which is why it's been used for so long, over the centuries even. The safflower oil dries more slowly and forms a brittle paint film. So why mix that in? Well, I like the slower drying time, and the one downside of linseed oil is that it will yellow as it dries. The safflower oil will not yellow. So that's essentially my materials. I use a painting knife usually to clean the paint off the palette. I don't actually use it to paint, and of course just a mixing knife to use my mixtures. In terms of the odds and ends and little tools that I use, you'll see that I use a value scale quite a bit. And of course when I'm painting plein air, I use a viewfinder, typical among plein air painters. But that's my materials. So I'm going to start the demo now, but I'm going to precede each little part of it with going into a little more depth about what I'm doing and about the process. So again, my painting process started with choosing the subject matter. So this is a photo of the scene that I'm going to be painting today. It's an old dairy farm right across the road from my house, 100 yards away. I've painted on the property for years and have still always loved this scene. When you choose a scene, the most critical question to ask, assuming that there's something in this scene that you really love and you decided you want to paint it, is ask yourself why. Try to be as specific as possible about why you want to paint this scene. Why is that an important question? Well, chances are the answer will tell you what your focal point is going to be. It's going to be the message, the whole point of doing this painting. So for me, when I was really interested in this scene, I love the flowing water, I love the trees, but more specifically in this, what always attracted me was that little horizontal glint of light coming off the water and the juxtaposition of the horizontals across the water and the meadow as opposed to the verticals of those trees. That's picked up both in the real tree and in the reflections. So that tells me right away that then my focal point is going to be in the midground. It's not going to be in the sky. It's not going to be in the foreground water. It's going to be in the middle ground where that light catches the top of the water and then recedes into the shadows of those trees. That's an important information to know. I want to keep that in mind the entire time I'm painting, because if not, I could lose the message of the painting. So step number 2 then is gathering information. I like to think of it when you walk out on a scene of like being a kid or a poet or, being open. You're an artist, so you're totally open to the scene. And what is there that can grab my soul and make me want to paint it? But as soon as I decide that, I want to become an engineer or a hard-nosed scientist. I need information. Ideally, I could sit there and paint a plein air painting from it. But if I'm going to be working from photographs, I need to take multiple photographs from various views with multiple exposures. I need as much information as I can because I know the camera cannot compete with the human eye. So I will take photographs. I will do tonal sketches. Often with a sketchbook, I'll take a sketchbook with me and sit down and do just some quick tonal sketches. These are a variety of tonal sketches, obviously not done from this scene, but I just wanted to show you just the variety that I do, often with pen and ink, and then I use Tombow brand brush pens, just a grayscale. I'm interested in trying to establish 2 things in these sketches, a composition and a value structure. On location. It helps also trigger the memory of it. So when I'm on location, maybe a plein air study, taking photographs, tonal studies, the important thing is don't take a shot of the landscape and then rush to the studio to paint it. Quality time matters in this case. The longer you spend on the landscape, the more you experience it, the more you study it, the more you study its colors, which the camera won't capture, the more likely that at least you'll take back with you a memory that can inform the photograph and the sketches and help you create a painting that does not look like a copied photograph, but looks like actually a memory, a scene that you experienced in real life. So choose the scene, gather the information, and I spend as much time on the landscape as I can before heading to the studio. When I go back to the studio though, I, as soon as possible, will edit that information so that memory is still there. The feelings, that emotional connection that I felt to the landscape is still there. So I usually will start with photographs. So now let's talk about editing photographs. Before I start, and I want to make this point absolutely clear, I do not advocate copying from photographs. Have I said that already? That's a surefire way to kill your painting. Use the photograph, but you're a painter. You're a painter. You're not a photographer, and you're not a newspaper reporter. Use this as raw information. I use photographs like an architect uses bricks for the building. The brick is not the building. The photograph does not become the painting. Parts of it inform the painting, parts of it inspire the painting. So what am I looking for when I take these photographs back to the studio, download them, and then work in them with Photoshop? What I'm trying to do is not find a perfect photo that I can copy. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is create a photo that most matches my memory of the scene that I was just at. That's why I like when I'm out on location and taking photographs, I'll do a sketch, take more photographs. I like to get back to the studio as quickly as I can. What I want to paint from is a memory in my head, because a memory is both visual and it's emotional. It's both. Whereas a photograph cannot record the emotions. So I want to take a photograph in the studio, I will adjust, I'll crop it, play around with the elements, I will change the values, and I will change the color in Photoshop to recreate what I feel is a photo that's close enough to my memory that while I'm painting it, it's evoking those memories and helping me paint something that it has more life than just a dead photograph. So this is probably one of maybe 20 raw photographs that I took, 20, 25, 30. Sometimes I'll take even more from different angles, different viewpoints, and different exposures. This was the one scene that I thought I could see a good painting hidden in this photograph. Taking the photograph into Photoshop, the first thing I did was I cropped it. So I essentially just brought in the borders. I also cropped it to the proportion of the canvas that I thought would most fit the composition. So after cropping it, then I will work with color. And I'll go back and forth. You'll see, for instance, that there is a clump of reeds or grass on the far left corner. You'll notice how I move those up and enlarge them. I will cut and paste elements. I alter the saturation of the colors, the hue of the colors. It's a little hard to see in this, but in my photograph, the sky was nearly white. In the altered photograph, I've dropped colors in the sky, exploring the value, how would the different values of the sky change the mood. Again, I'm trying to recreate in what my memory of that scene was, which is always richer and always more interesting, I think, than what a photograph can capture. Once I reach this stage, and this can take sometimes an hour or two in Photoshop, it goes back to what I said about that pyramid. I will sweat the composition and the value structure. It's got to work. So I will spend whatever time I need getting it to work. I look at this photograph and I say, okay, there is a scene that has enough visual information that I could work with that as a painting. Taking it into Photoshop, keeping it in Photoshop as well, then I will typically paste a value scale to the left. And then I will take samples of that photograph and position them on the value scale. I need to know what those values are. And it's not enough to know that the sky is light and the shadows are dark and the meadow is a slightly light midtone. What's important with values are their relationships, not just their absolute values. So I need to know how much lighter is the sky than the grass. How much darker are the lights in the trees as opposed to the shadows in the trees. And I will spend a fair amount of time just mapping out these values. So notice in the value scale how the values here represent the trees, the water are here, this is the meadow, and this is the sky. Do you notice how they get clumped on that value scale? That's the value structure. That is those 2 to 5 values that will create the structure in the painting. I need that information. Notice too that I also pasted a small thumbnail of the scene. Often when the scene is smaller, we can see the value structure much more clearly than when the scene is blown up. Enlarged, we see detail and color. Small, it's much easier to see shapes and values. So I find that very important. So when I've reached this stage, I've identified the values, I've pasted up a thumbnail. This is not giving me so much the compositional information, but it's giving me the value information that I need. So this is as far as I will go with this photo. It's not there to copy, it's there just to provide me with information. But let me say a word about Photoshop, and I know that that can be intimidating to a lot of people. Because I was a former freelance illustrator, I used to color my work digitally, and I use Photoshop. I'm very comfortable with these skills. You don't need Photoshop to do this painting process that I do. You can print out a photograph and use simply a value scale to identify those values. You can, I know, take it on an iPad. There are several tools on iPad where you can change the color, you can convert it to black and white, which is what I often did. Do anything you can to help you look at the photograph with fresh eyes and to help you identify those values. You do not need to go out and spend the money on Photoshop nor learn how to use it. But you do need to look at that information and say, where are the values in these elements in the landscape? How dark are the shadows in the trees? How light is the light in the sky? And how does that compare with the grass? How does it compare with the values in the water? That's what's important, not knowing Photoshop. So I want to make sure you understand that point. So I've finished editing this photo in Photoshop, but that's not meaning I've finished editing this information I've gathered for this scene. I also will often take any little tonal thumbnails I've done on location, bring them back, blow them up, and play around with shapes. The photograph in Photoshop provides me with information about the values of the painting that I need, but this is where I compose the scene. Yes, I played with composition in the photograph only because often it can, I can try out ideas, but ultimately this is where I want to develop the simple shapes. Now, what I do not copy, though, are the values. I put the values in there so I can see the shapes, but these are not the value relationships I'll paint. I'll use the photograph and the value scale from the photograph to paint the values. So with this in mind, with this in hand, I have the composition worked out. In this page, I've put a grid, which I've then also transferred to the canvas. And with my photograph at hand, I'm ready to start the underpainting. So I'm just getting set up to start the demo. I'm going to move this over here, which is what I'll use for reference to draw in the shapes in line. The first thing I'm going to do is just lay out a little of the burnt sienna because I'm doing an underpainting again. I'm not going into color yet. And a little bit of the burnt umber. If I need to thin the paint, I'll use some of the safflower linseed oil mixture. I might as well leave that out. Although neither the umber nor the sienna are toxic, I do prefer wearing gloves. And at this stage, all I'm going to do is just sketch in those shapes, essentially transfer the shapes from my sketch to the canvas. Using this as reference, if the sketch works perfectly, I will very carefully copy it from here to here. But often, I do enjoy always having an opportunity to redraw something if I need to. So let me talk first, before I actually start doing this, just about composition. Composition is the most important element of painting, but it's often the hardest to give advice, to give rules for. It's easier to describe what not to do when composing a scene than it is to what to do. Typically you don't want to put any strong contrasts or areas of interest on the edge. You want to avoid the dead center. You want to avoid especially any sizes on the canvas of equal shape. You want to avoid any lines that are in alignment or parallel to each other. Most of those rules of composition can be broken successfully. There is one rule, though, that you absolutely cannot break in the terms of composition, and that is you cannot have your painting say more than one thing. And by that I mean simply, and this often is a problem with landscape artists, you see a scene with a beautiful sky and then the light splashing on the hills, and then there are foreground fields through which a stream is coming, and right at the foreground is this gorgeous play of water and light. And in your painting, you want to capture it all. You want to give me a beautiful sky, incredible hills, a beautiful field, and this water that's just grabbing my eye. You're trying to say four things at one time, and I won't know what to listen to. Think of an analogy of an orchestra. An orchestra playing a classical tune Some instruments will be playing the melody. Everything else is backup, playing harmony and rhythm, but they're not drowning out the melody. You need to find out what the melody of your scene is and stick with that and not try to say anything more than that. Let everything else support this. So as I said, I want to focus on that splash of light coming across the water, and then that area as it recedes into the trees. I love that play of the lightest light, the darkest dark being near each other, and just the horizontals contrasting against the verticals. That is going to be the focus of the painting. So it's composing it right now, I want to make sure that the focal point is in an area that makes sense, and then especially when I start to flush this painting out in color, I want to make sure that I don't have too many areas of interest on the edges. Contrast is everything. Contrast draws the eye, and that can be value contrast, color contrast, contrast in the amount of details, contrast in edges. Typically, you want to avoid a lot of contrast on the edge of the canvas and put the greatest amount of contrast in your focal point. I'll go into that more, especially as we start the values in the underpainting. So looking at this, typically I usually start with the horizon line. I want to determine where the horizon line is. Notice in the way I've composed this scene, both in the sketch and in the photo, the horizon line is awfully close to the middle of the canvas. I'm not concerned about that because this little section right here, this background field that I invented and just dropped in Photoshop, that's almost exactly in the middle, but the focal point here is so much stronger. This is really it's secondary. It's not going to hurt this. So, and in fact, in my sketch, I dropped it down even a little bit further. So that background field, which really represents the horizon line, is maybe something like this. Okay, so I've established the horizon line just at this point. I'm going to note right now the horizontal line of the water, and it appears to be slightly below half of that in that square. Maybe that edge of the bank comes in, and this is fairly horizontal. Again, this is all just in line. I want to keep the lines fairly light. I've added a little oil to it. I have to be careful. You don't want too many layers you don't want too much oil on the lower layers of your painting. So often I'll use just the minimal I can, just enough to make the paint a little more fluid. And now it's just a matter of blocking in some of the lines that I'm seeing in the sketch. When I have a sketch that works really well, I don't look at the photograph. I look at the sketch because that's my composition. To look at the photograph, then I could end up starting to paint two different scenes. Now, I'm looking now at the vertical of the sky shape between the two trees, upper left. I have to be careful that does not line up with the bottom of this edge of the bank here. So in my sketch, I've moved it slightly to the right. I might want to move it slightly more to the right. And in my sketch, I've kind of hinted at the loose quality of those, maybe hills in the background here, the loose quality of these leaves. At this point, I want to keep that fairly loose, especially because these edges, when I paint them in the underpainting, this is foliage. It's going to be very loosely painted. The top of the meadow on the left side, it looks as if it disappears about there. Now that might be, I think I need to bring this up maybe a little bit. I don't have to copy it absolutely exactly because it's all going to be painted over with the underpainting and then even again with the color. But it's worthwhile at least trying to be fairly accurate to respect the sketch. This edge of the meadow goes just below midpoint. It's a fairly smooth line in my sketch. I will probably loosen that up and make it a little more interesting in the underpainting. Then the shadow from the trees, it looks like it angles down to about this point. In the background, that shadow forms a shape, almost a parallel shape, maybe two parallel. Want to be careful with that. And then there's the distant bank and just the touch of this river showing triangle here. So this tree comes down here, this tree is here, and then the last line, well, I still have to do this. This comes across, down. I'm going to put that mark in there because that stops the eye here, and then this is all bank. The reflection would come this way. I'll continue the bank up. Notice in the photograph, this receding bank is a straight line. I wanted to make it more interesting, so I just broke it up. That again, it's just the sort of thing that if you copy a photograph, you are not going to notice, you're not going to see, and you're going to end up with, frankly, just a less interesting line of that stream. So now I need to do the right side of the center tree, and that is approximately here. It comes down to that. There's a more round tree here, which I changed from the photograph. I had closed the gap in the photograph between these two trees. And this is just a kind of a quick rough sketch to indicate I think I want loose foliage there. If this is a fairly hard edge line, hard meaning fairly distinct, dense foliage, I would like to see it get a little more loose up here, just for variety's sake. Okay, top of the meadow, edge of the trees, and there's just a hint of that tree is here. Now that actually is, I think, a hint of maybe a bare tree. I felt that the composition, even after doing this sketch, that the composition is a little heavy on this side. I feel like it needs something on this side. So maybe it's a bare tree here, or maybe it's just a bare tree here with a hint of branches. I don't know. I will see simply if that works when I do the underpainting. So this bank is being reflected. This sky is coming straight down off of that tree, so I have a reflection there. And then this one, of course, down here, with just a touch of the sky, maybe indicated here. So this is, I mean, it's not an exact copy, but I think it captures the major shapes, captures the lines, and allows me at least to see where I need to put in my values. So that's it for the sketch. I'll now turn to the photograph to help me mix the values. If you notice on the left side of the photograph, again, the grayscale, I talked about how those values clumped. What I'm going to do, what I typically do, is use a value scale, simply a printed value scale. I will mix the darkest of those colors, those pairs, and then match it on this value scale. Put the paint right on it to make sure I match it. I need to get those value relationships correct for the painting to really work. So I will literally, physically will mix the paint and put it on here to match it. Do you need to match and mix every little square you put if you use this method? No, you don't. Although to do that is to give yourself some great training in both mixing paint and in identifying values. But I find that working on a white canvas, I can use the darkest of every pair of these value chips, and then if I need to lighten it, I simply wipe away, revealing the canvas beneath. I actually get three things by doing that. One, yes, it lightens the value, but also because this is white, the color of the underpainting color will be rich, like a mahogany. I don't have to mix white in it, which often deadens it and makes it cooler. And I'm also keeping the paint film thin, just so that there's not a lot of paint buildup on the canvas, so this can dry quickly. So I'll now mix some of these values I see on the screen. And it appears to be about maybe in this area in the value scale. This printed value scale is not going to correspond perfectly to the value scale that I have in Photoshop. It just won't. But I'm really looking for value relationships. So even though this value scale is not quite as, doesn't extend from the pure white to the dark in Photoshop, that's okay. I just use this as reference for the value relationships. So how do I know when I've matched the value? Well, I often will just, with a palette knife, put a little paint directly on the value scale, and to determine whether it's too light, too dark, whether I need to add white or more paint to it. I'm going to add, in this case, a little more white to lighten it. I'm really looking to mix a value about the maybe third from the darkest on this value scale. Still far too dark. All right. And you can see that if I'm painting a large painting and I really want to work on the values just precisely, I could end up having to mix maybe 10 piles of values. I know this, you know, to some of you it may seem like mindless grunt work, but this is how you build a painting. Just as digging a foundation to build your perfect dream house doesn't seem very romantic. Getting these values correct at the very beginning can make all the difference in the world. Now, the best way to compare two values, put them adjacent to each other and squint. And if they essentially disappear, you know you're on the right track, that they are more or less the same values. So that, I only hope I mixed enough of it. We'll find out. That should be the dark of the shadows for the trees. You can see that it's really not that dark. And in fact, it's not that dark because I'm going to deliberately make it one step darker. I think that's a little too close to middle value. I think it's because this value scale isn't quite as accurate as the Photoshop's value scale. So I'm going to make it a little bit darker, maybe go one step down on this value scale and match it to that value. So that's still a little bit light. Okay, so it's a little, just a touch lighter, but I will use that as the dark of the trees. Moving up to the reflection in the water, that value appears to be between the third and fourth chip on this value scale. So it's only a little bit lighter than the It's only a little bit lighter than the value of the darks in the trees. A little more paint. I actually enjoy doing underpaintings quite a bit because there's a certain playful quality. As you'll see, although maybe not on this canvas because it's rather small, but when I paint with a 30 by 40 canvas and underpainting, I won't touch a brush. I'll do the entire thing with a rag. Keeping very loose, and it just feels like play, smearing and adjusting, and you add darks, you pull out lights until it really works. Okay, that's essentially the value of the water, the dark values of the water. And the value of the meadow grass is lighter than 50%. So I'm looking for maybe a value of here for the meadow, or maybe a little bit lighter. I think it's going to be about here would work best. That's clearly too dark. This might seem really just mechanical, like just drudgery, but it was drudgery for Michelangelo to be laying all that wet plaster before he could do all the fun painting with color. So it's just part of making the painting work, focusing on this underpainting. Still a little dark. I think at this point I want to keep these values clearly defined. That is the dark of the trees. That's going to be the dark of the water. That is scrap, which I can use. And let's see, we should be getting close to this value. Maybe just a little bit lighter. Sometimes it's astonishing how much, as you start to work these values, just how far apart they can be and how off you can be when you think you've got it. Now I'm going to end up with probably far too much paint, but okay, there we go. Can you see how close that is to that value? That's going to be the value of the meadow. And my last value is the value of the sky, which is going to be just a little bit. I really don't even need the value scale for that, because that's going to be white with probably just enough value of the sienna in it to tone it. Well, maybe worth checking anyway. That's still a little dark. Okay, can be a little bit lighter. At this point, I will probably just rely on wiping it from the canvas to reveal the white. Okay, so there are the values. Darks are the shadows here, the darks of the water here, the meadow value here, and the sky value here. Before I start, why do an underpainting? Well, why work just solely with values? Why not paint with color, because color has value? Why not go right into color? There are several reasons. One, it's value, not color, that creates the illusion of space. It's value, not color, that creates the illusion of light. And it's value that creates the illusion of form. If you can solve all of those issues just on an underpainting, it will make the addition of color much easier. In part two, because value is a component of color. So imagine trying to juggle 3 balls. You know, color has 3 attributes. It has hue, what we usually mean by color. It has saturation, what we mean by a rich color or a muted or a grayed down color. And it has value. By taking value out of that, you only have to juggle 2 balls when it comes time to adding color. We would have solved all the value problems now with the underpainting. So you're really creating for yourself a much more easier way not only to establish the composition and the value structure, but to actually later work in color. I'm going to start with the darkest dark, the shadows of the trees. And now that I'm actually working in the values, I'm finished with my tonal sketch, which I use to establish the composition, and I'm going to refer now to the value scale and the photograph for the values of this painting. The values again, and I used to often convert the photograph to black and white to help me see it. I don't do that anymore, in part because I want to really master the ability to look at a color and know exactly what its value is. So I prefer now to work from a color photograph. But if you struggle with this at all, by all means, convert the photograph to black and white or have it printed out at black and white and just use that as the value information. Some of the secrets of doing an underpainting, or I guess I said that there are no secrets, right? But one of the important points of doing an underpainting is to keep your edges soft and do not start to think in terms of detail at all. I am looking for just the major value shapes. So I'm going to very quickly block in, and you can see I mentioned that I'm hard on brushes. I scumble a lot with a brush. I'm keeping the paint film thin and keeping it very loose, not trying to, at this point, not trying to get fussy at all with details. There will be plenty of time for details. Again, this is the darkest darks, the shadows in the trees. Seeing these as simply masked values. Some of those darks are over on this side. Got a little bit, need a little bit more color on that. That tree there is actually maybe a little bit dark. I can control all these darks just by wiping, but at this moment I'm just going to lay in these values as quickly and as loosely as I can. Now I'm going to extend, take my brush, grab more of that, and I'm going to extend this up, knowing though that as I do, more and more of the white of the canvas will show through, which is fine, because as I'm looking at this, there are 2 things that jump out at me. Gradients. I'm seeing that especially in the water here, do you notice how the gradient goes from a dark to a lighter tone here, the gradient expressed right here? That's an important gradient. Any horizontal plane. Any horizontal field, a sheet of water will have a gradient. That gradient being a subtle change in value or color as a plane moves into the distance. Here it's not so subtle. That's a fairly noticeable change, how the water becomes darker as it comes into the foreground. I need that gradient because it will create the illusion that this water is going in the distance. However, there's also a gradient that I really like from the darks of the trees. They tend to fade as they go up, as you go from into the darks of the shadows here up into the leaves. It gives the illusion of light coming out of the sky and lightening that area, flooding that area. So again, just some rough scumbles. Going to need a little more dark. Keeping that fairly loose. And then this is where I'll often use a paper towel, keeping the edges soft, picking up some of the paint maybe with the gradient, lightening up the tops of the trees, softening edges, and then even if I need to, showing the lights of the trees by just smearing some of the paint and starting to indicate just some very simple lights and dark shapes in the trees, hitting the shadows. I want to cover the white though. I don't want to have a lot of the white canvas showing through. This gradient I want to be fairly a smooth gradient so it's not too abrupt from top to bottom. And at this point, in terms of brushwork, I really would like to keep the brushwork fairly simple, just vertically. If I start to turn the brush a lot, you can get light reflecting off the brush strokes in different ways, and it creates the illusion of different changes in value, when in reality it's just a change in the brush stroke. Just keeping things fairly smooth. I do use, which is why I like to wear gloves with an underpainting, even though it's non-toxic. I do use my fingers quite a bit. So just blocking that in for the trees. Okay, let's move on to the water. The shadows in the water were a little bit lighter. I'm going to mix a little bit of the dark in for the very top of the water. Notice how the highlight of the water was approximately here. And this shadow then, or I'm sorry, not a shadow, this is a reflection. A reflection in the water comes down here, getting a little bit lighter as it comes down. Just blocking in this shape. Now I'm going to use that same dark to block in the darks in the grass on both sides. I liked in the photo how those shadows in the bank seem to frame on either side what's going on here, making sure though that this was not the same size. Can you see how important it is that this dark shape here isn't exactly repeated over here? It starts to look like bookends, and it just flattens the scene out. And now as the gradient comes down, as the reflection comes down, it's going to get a little bit lighter. Again, I hope you can see at this point that I am not at all concerned with details. There's no fussing at all here. Just blocking in the important values. This is the value structure that I talked about. Starting to try to pull that illusion a little bit back, okay? Let's make that a little bit smoother. I'm going to just lighten this up just a touch. I don't want that to be quite as dark as that. At that point it looked like as if it were exactly the same value. And I'll even right now, I can just quickly indicate maybe some reflections from the grass, even though I haven't even put the grass in. All right, so let's knock in the grass. keeping it very, very loose, essentially. Maybe I'll put in a little bit more dark here while I have that paint. Bring that up a little bit to work the grass, and then working the grass into it as I come down more into the foreground. Now, often when I start blending with my finger like this, I find that the darkest darks start to get light because I'm mixing, getting a little bit of that light paint into the darks. So I'll have to go back in and reestablish those darks. I don't want too much paint on here. I don't want to have to be pushing a lot of paint around. I want to keep this layer fairly thin. Soft edges. And just continue working these shapes. All right, still working on the meadow. I'm getting a little bit of dark paint in this, but again, you just don't. This isn't a time to be fussing with anything. Especially until I get all of this white covered. This white is going to change the way it's going to affect all the values in this painting. And until I get it covered, completely covered, it really is hard to finesse any of these values. Keeping the edges soft, fairly flat tones. I don't want to have a whole lot of streakiness or anything else in these values. I really want to be able to judge them for what they are. Let's see, I've worked with the meadow tone. The background hill is actually, in this area, it's a little bit darker than the meadow. Now I'm putting it in too dark, but that's fine because I'm just going to lighten it up by wiping it off. So you can see that I'm not mixing. When I mix these values, I try to get them fairly accurate. And compare them with the value scale. Once I start painting, the painting is the point. The painting trumps everything else. All my calculations, all my carefully laid plans. What works here is what's important. So I feel fairly comfortable throwing in, say, a value that may be a little too dark initially, because as long as I can change it, and then I can judge it in relation to all of these others, that's going to work fine. This shouldn't be paint by numbers, and it's not meant to be a painful exercise in just matching a value scale. But it is important to get the value relationships correct. Okay, so this could probably be maybe a little bit darker. I'm going to now come in and wipe. There are two things that may qualify as details, and I try to save all the details to the very end of the painting. But in this case, this background field and this streak of light are so important, I think, to the focal point and to the look of the painting that I want to indicate those now. Just a touch of that field by pulling it off. I can adjust the values very easily by smearing the paint. Obviously, it doesn't want to be the same value as the trees back here. Maybe I need to pull off just a little bit more. I'm going to darken this area right now by just pulling some of that paint over the white, just to kill that white. It's just too strong. And this is the shadow. Now this I know is going to be end up getting being more darkened. I've got to come back in here and work with the darks a little bit more. I want to keep this fairly amorphous, undefined, which is fine at this point. Just blocking in those values. And this is little bit of the river reflected in the back. And also I want to pull out the white of the light. So I'm pushing into the canvas. Another reason that I prefer painting on panels rather than stretch canvas is I can put a fair amount of force in there to get that streak of light. And you can see what a difference that makes, what that does to these other values. Kind of brings them alive. Next, I'm going to move to the sky, which is reflected in the water. And just a point about reflections. Reflections tend to bring the lights and the darks of the objects being reflected toward the middle scale, middle of the value scale. So a light area, such as the sky, is going to darken slightly as it's reflected. A dark area, such as the shadows in the trees here, are going to become lighter when they're reflected. It's just that the reflection, especially because the water has the ambient light of the sky shining down on it, it tends to appear a little bit lighter. And because it also has depth, though, it's not a perfect mirror, so the sky light will be slightly darkened. Let's just move into let me move into the sky value. By the way, when I scumble this on, I typically will then, if I'm crossing any of those pencil marks, the grids, I stay there with the paint and scumble long enough that it simply dissolves the pencil. You don't want that. You do not want that grid to show through the final underpainting, because it may be then that it shows through the final painting when you add color. You want to avoid having that show through. Now I had this brush I haven't cleaned, so I am getting this paint is I'm actually mixing a little of the paint, the darker paint, in the sky with the brush. But again, I'm just going to wipe that off with the paper towels, keeping this fairly loose. So my sky lights. Keeping it, again, loose as can be. Maybe a little bit darker up here. You notice though that because I've added white to the burnt sienna, I'm already starting to get a little color contrast. How it looks a little more bluish, just a touch more blue. At this point, I'm not concerned about that. This is still going to read as pretty much as a monochromatic scene. Now the darks in the water, for the reflections in the water, I'm using the grass value. It's about the same value, and it's just a little bit lighter at the top where there's a gradient. So maybe I'll lighten that up just a little bit as it goes up top, and then darken this a little bit down the bottom. I'm just going to smear a little bit of that reflected light into the water so it becomes a very soft edge. Okay, now these shapes are not really well drawn. I mean, that shape doesn't line up, but I think I'm just going to have to move that tree over a little bit, which is what I do. This is looking a little narrow anyway compared to this. Now, I hope you can see at this point, and I think right now I'm going to do this just to blend some of the brush strokes. It's easier for me just to see this without a lot of brush work. Now, at this point, there's a sense of light and form. I would not stop at this stage by any means. I really want to resolve some of the more subtle issues in this. But if it really works, even at this stage, chances are you're gonna have a painting that's going to be successful. If it doesn't work at this stage, you have to make changes. I'm going to go back in now and reestablish some of those darks because I've lost them. As they become lighter, slightly different, a cleaner brush. Let's see, and even maybe even a slightly larger brush. Not looking to paint details at all. I just want to go back in and establish some of the darks. Dragging it into the paint there. I don't want to have I don't want to have any hard edges at this point. Some of the darks under the trees here, having those darks fade up. Now may be a good time to move this tree just a little bit to the left. Have some of the areas of foliage. I know that any mistake, if it just doesn't work, it's just so easy at this stage to wipe out. The underpainting, I'm just looking for the essentials in this landscape. The value structure and the way these shapes are going to start to work together. Now there's a nice mid-value, just see where the shadow of the tree meets the shadow of the grass. In the photo, there's actually almost a transition value between the two. Just a nice soft break to that. So I'm going to just soften that just a little, enough to indicate that now I've got a bank that's halfway in shadow here. Establish darks there. And some of the darks here. Now there's a nice dark in the bank there. I like the dark here. There's a dark on this side. I have to indicate at some point where the banks meet the water, and there's some shadows there. And of course this is quite shadowed. I find that if I make really good decisions at the beginning of the painting, I wouldn't say the painting paints itself, but it just makes it so much easier, because when you make good decisions and everything is working, if something's slightly off, it'll jump out. And it's then a lot easier just to see what that next stroke will be. If the painting is not working, sometimes it can just be very hard to decide what it needs. And then you try to not listen to those voices of the doomsayers in your head say, oh my gosh, this isn't working. It's not working. What's going on here? Not that I'm panicking with this at all, but it just it goes often. A painting will go through a phase of getting slightly out of balance in the values, or in color when we work in color, and then you have to go back in and reestablish.
Paintings, when done well, create an emotional response. The goal of a painter should be to create a landscape that transports the viewer into the scene, where it evokes deep feelings and emotions. If you paint a snow scene, your viewer should shiver and feel the cold blowing snow. A beach scene should let the viewer feel the warmth of the sun, the sound of the crashing waves, and the sand between their toes. A forest creek should have your viewers experiencing the peace of the woods, their hands reaching into the cool water, and hearing the sounds of a trickling stream. To paint emotional landscapes, it's important to study from a master landscape artist who has conquered the nuances of light, the energy of the foliage, and the perfect balance of color to create an atmosphere where you can tell the temperature just by looking at the scene. Nowhere will you find that sort of master instruction than with John MacDonald, one of the most successful and prominent artists in North America, and one of the world's great teachers.
I am not going to be offering you any secrets, any special techniques known only the chosen few, any secret formulas that'll make your paintings glow like a Vermeer. I'm a firm believer in the basics, and I think that you will find that your painting will improve the more you can focus on and master and come to a deeper understanding of the basics: composition, value, color, edges, etc.
You'll discover incredible insights, which are the important keys to mastering any art form.
It's value, not color, that creates the illusion of space. It's value, not color, that creates the illusion of light. And it's value that creates the illusion of form. If you can solve all of those issues just on an underpainting, it will make the addition of color much easier. In part two, because value is a component of color.
Don't be misled. While this course focuses on the basic elements of painting, which beginners will certainly benefit from, each element is covered in such depth that even experienced painters will benefit from it. In fact, many of the world's leading artists seek out instruction from John to help them elevate their paintings to a higher level.
Color luminosity you create by two different colors, warm, cool, keeping them exactly the same value. Well, you can get that essentially in one brushstroke.
You'll find the insights in this video incredibly unique. John MacDonald is a painter's painter, and one who will elevate your own overall skills by demonstrating these important principles and showing how to make such emotionally appealing and sublime paintings.
Painting is not a spectator sport. We can't sit back and just watch and listen or look. Yes, we can learn a lot from books, we can learn a lot from magazines, attending conventions, attending workshops, and talking to other artists. But ultimately, we learn to paint by painting. It's the only way we can really learn.
Creating Dynamic Landscapes, on DVD and streaming video.
Well, that's called Creating Dynamic Landscapes with John MacDonald. You can learn more about the entire full-length video course at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, we have a special discount code on that video today only. Just look in the comments section. Now let's get right to our interview with what might be the world's nicest guy, John MacDonald. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines. And today we have John MacDonald with us. John, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you and I first met in the Adirondack Mountains, I believe.
We did at your event, I think 4 or 5 years ago.
So what I thought was really fascinating is I didn't know about you. You know, people have, there are regional stars, if you will, and you live in the Berkshires, and you're well known in the East, in the region. But I wasn't aware of you because I don't live in the Berkshires. I live in the Adirondacks in the summer. But what I found fascinating is that people were kind of globbing onto you and watching you paint and wanting to learn how you paint. And that's when I gained a lot of respect for you as a painter, when I first saw your paintings. And you know, we bring them in at night and everybody's looking at everybody's paintings, and yours were standing out above the crowd. So one of the reasons you're here is because of that opportunity when we met at the Publishers Invitational in the Adirondacks.
Such a great event. Yeah, terrific event.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, isn't it?
It is. It is, and I've spoken to so many artists. I think what we like about that is the feeling of camaraderie, the lack of a hierarchy, where you can just go and paint, rub shoulders with beginners, with masters, and just pick up on everybody's energy, and being reminded constantly by the most raw recruits to the art, the very beginning painters, of the important questions to ask. I invariably come back from the Adirondacks having learned something that I learned from a very beginner painter. Sometimes it's just an attitude, you know, so it's good. It's a great event, yeah. So
last year, I was driving to Boston, and I decided to stop at your studio. And we did a little video of a studio visit. Yeah. But what I was fascinated with was your process, which you'll be talking about, I'm sure. But you have used technology to aid your process. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it came out of a stretch of maybe 15 years when my wife and I, our first of two sons was born, and I realized that financially I wanted to just contribute a little more to the family's income. So I went back to what I'd always been doing on the side as a freelance illustrator. And at the time I was using Scratchboard, a black and white medium, using a sharp tool to scratch away ink on a white surface. And I absolutely loved it. It was like an etching, it could be like a woodcut. But more and more of my clients asked for color. And it's a nightmare to color because if you use watercolor dyes, it soaks into the ground of the scratch board and looks awful. So I finally realized it was time to get a computer, and I started coloring the work in Photoshop. So over the course of 10, 12 years, I got very skilled in using Photoshop in a very narrow range of all that the program offers, but mainly about manipulating images. So that then around the 2000s, as I started to phase out my career as an illustrator and wanted to get back full-time as a painter, I realized I could use those skills to manipulate photographs. So that is, I would take a photograph, and in the old days, whether I printed it or it was on my monitor, I might grab my sketchbook and do 2 or 3 little thumbnails of different ways to crop it, different ways to apply the major values of the shapes, to establish the value structure of the painting with a pencil. I found that I could do a lot of that in Photoshop much more quickly, which allowed a lot more for me creative freedom. I could try 15 different croppings in the time it would take me to do 2 with the pencil. And it made me aware of just the power of the program. So although I still do quite a bit of plein air painting as much as I can for a variety of reasons, not the least of which it's just great training. It teaches you exactly what the camera cannot capture. But I do a lot of plein air, but almost all my larger work now in the studio, I use photograph sketches and, when I can, a plein air color study done on location.
So there are some people who might scold you for using photographs, because there are some purists who believe that everything should be done from life, that everything is going to be distorted because of a photograph. Is it that you've trained yourself to understand what nature is going to do because you were plein air painting, so that when you do paint from a photo, you can get that sense of life?
Yes, I can understand that attitude because I was there in the early 2000s. When I was still doing some illustration, I spent maybe 3 years painting solely outdoors. I would do no painting in the studio. That was where I did illustration, and I wanted to keep them separate. So I spent 3 years, and if I didn't finish a painting, I'd have to wait till the weather conditions were approximately the same to go back out on location and work on that painting. I think that yes, you need plein air. Any landscape painter has to paint plein air, go through at least a phase of painting plein air. If not, and if you rely solely on photographs, I think that can show in the photo. Where a photograph, though, is a kiss of death for an artist is if the focus is outward and you are simply copying the photograph. So what I use photographs for often in Photoshop is I am not looking to create an ideal photograph that then I simply copy. That of one single image that I look at and say, this will make a great painting if I copy it exactly. That would still look like a copied photograph. What I'm always aiming at is to create a photo, and I will alter both the cropping, but I will also alter the values of the image and the values in the color as well. I'm trying to recreate that scene as I remembered it. Including the way I felt about it. So for me, it's the feelings of an artist on location. That's one of the great advantages of being plein air. You're not just seeing something, you're in that scene. You're living in that landscape. You're as much an integral part of that landscape as a tree or a cloud that you're painting. I think that has a great power on the psyche and the soul of an artist that can come out in the painting. But if I simply run out to a landscape, take a photograph, and go back to the studio and copy it, that photograph is a soulless mechanical reproduction of what the lens sees, not even what the human eye sees. And then you end up copying a soulless reproduction of just an image. The camera cannot record your emotions. the artist's emotions, the artist's feelings. What attracted you to this scene in the first place? Often it has much more to do than just a simple color relationship or the story of an old tractor in the field. There is an emotional connection to the landscape that exists when we're plein air that cannot exist in the studio if all you do is rely on a photograph. So I have my foot in both camps. I understand perfectly why there are some who say you cannot copy from photographs. And that is true, but I think you can use photographs simply for visual reference, as visual raw material, information, that you can use then to recreate the memories and the feelings that you felt when you were on location.
Well, that's something that's very hard to articulate. So when you go out in plein air and you're walking through the woods and you find a spot that speaks to you, you're like, there's something about this that you're having an emotional connection to. How do you translate that into a painting?
Because there are no tubes that say drama. There's not a tube that says tranquility. There's not a tube that says peace. Exactly. It's all, well, there's the skill component of that. We have to know as artists how to compose a painting, how to manipulate value relationships that create one mood as opposed to another. How a soft edge can actually create an emotional tone to a painting that all hard edges won't. I think that's part of both learning skills as an artist, but being mindfully aware that as an artist, as a human being, I'm responding to this with emotion and with all the experience in my story and my history, and that can influence the way I want to paint. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Is it just to produce pictures, or is it a way to, for me, it's always been a way of connecting to the landscape. I've often said that for me, painting plein air is really a form of meditation. If I didn't know how to paint, I could still be very happy sitting in a meadow for 2 hours and just watching what happens. It's a miracle. You know, everything is miraculous out there. And just enjoy the color relationships without painting. The painting is actually, for me, an important part of that meditative process because it stills my mind and gives me, it's like a chew toy for the mind. You know, the discursive mind that's always talking. When I paint on location, there is a part of my mind that just shuts down and is very still and is so intently focused on looking at these color relationships and recording them and mixing them. For me, a painting is an excuse for a way to more deeply experience a landscape than I ever could. It stills the mind, it makes me focus on relationships, color-light relationships, and try to capture a mood in paint. So, which goes back to using photos. I think that if you're in a landscape and you just simply take one photo and rush back to the studio, it's going to be very hard to capture any kind of a mood or a feeling in that painting that you experience because you weren't there long enough to experience a mood. Yeah. I think it's important, even if you use photographs, to spend as much time in the landscape as possible. Quality time matters. So take 30 photographs, different exposures, then sit and do a couple sketches, and if you can't, do a plein air color study. No intention to do a finished painting. You don't have to put that pressure on you. But it not only doing a plein air color study will not only give you a much more accurate record of the color relationships in the landscape than a camera ever could. It's also another 2 hours spent in that landscape, living it, experiencing it. I know that they said that Whistler was a huge advocate of painting from memory because he felt that was the essence of the landscape is what we remembered because we would only remember the most important things, what that landscape meant to us. So I think that's absolutely true. To go out into a landscape and experiencing it is going to affect you in a way that can come out in your paintings in a way that you will not happen if you just rush out, take one photograph, and then go home and paint it in the studio. If that makes sense. It
makes a lot of sense, and I've heard a couple of different philosophies on that. One philosophy is get out, find the spot that you respond to, set up your gear, and then don't put yourself under any pressure. Just sit there, enjoy it, look around, take in the birds and the sounds and the breeze on your face and the movement, and just actually take it all in and kind of get into kind of a meditative process. The painters in Russia that I've met and painted with, most of them are Orthodox, and they actually use painting as a form of prayer. They put themselves into a meditative state. But I've also heard some people say that the minute that you get there, get the part that you're excited about down on the canvas first. So if maybe it's the bark on a particular tree, don't try to execute the entire painting, but focus on getting that one piece first, because we get tired, we get fatigued, and so at least if you get that, you've got the primary thing.
I absolutely agree with that. And in fact, even when I don't have the time for a plein air study, but I'm on location and I know I have enough time to take photos, and I love to spend at least a half an hour on location to soak it in. That's so important to do that. I will almost always, even with camera in my hand, if I don't have my painting gear, ask myself, what is it about this scene that really is touching me? What is it that I'm so interested in? I have to identify that, because that is the message of the painting when I go back home. And I can't lose sight of that, whether or not it's the actual focal point, and often it is, but it's also just the message of the painting. For instance, I'm not a subject painter. That is, when I go out, I know a lot of painters love to paint an old barn or a tractor, or even in a city they might paint cafes or rundown factories. There's a narrative quality. They're telling a story in some ways, and that's a perfectly valid way of painting. Artists have done that for ages. I tend to be more of a formalist. When I'm in the landscape, I'm not concerned with a narrative that, oh, here's a farm, or here's an old tractor and the demise of agriculture. I'm much more interested in formal relationships, a mood, the atmosphere created by dramatic lighting or certain color or value relationships. So for me, I think it's especially important when I go out to ask myself, what exactly is it in this scene that I'm attracted to, that I feel such a pull towards wanting to put into paint? Often it's a quality of light. More often than not, I think as the years go by, it's a mood. I think at heart I am a tonalist. The American tonalist being, a varied group, but George Inness, I think, was considered one of the premier founders of the group, and he was a deeply spiritual person. For him, painting the landscape was a way of prayer and a spiritual, a lesson in his spirituality and his came out of his spiritual philosophy. So for me, that mood or atmosphere is a little more ambiguous than trying to capture, a certain tractor or something that's more geared towards subject matter.
Well, I think for some of the people who might be viewing this, maybe you could get into a little depth about what tonalism really is. I think that being a tonalist is one of the most difficult things a painter can do, because you're interpreting everything differently, right? You're out there seeing bright colored grass, but you're not making it bright colored. You're making everything within a range of tone.
The philosophy, and I wish I knew more about it than I do, but the philosophy is extremely varied. The artists that were clumped in with the tonalist shared some similarities, one of which they like to unify the painting, typically with one tone they often painted at a warm key. They used glazes and scumbling. They weren't interested, as the Impressionists were interested in the actual optics of the eye and the physics of the eye. They were much more interested in how a landscape felt, an emotional connection, whether it was spiritual or not. It had often much to do with an emotional connection to the landscape, and they love to capture the ephemeral moments of a landscape, which is why you rarely ever see a tonalist painting done at full noon under a blazing sun. They were much more likely to be a dusk or dawn scene with very few elements, hiding a lot of form. So much of it had to do with mood, capturing a certain mood, a certain time of the morning or afternoon when forms dissolved into a mist or a light. Very different work from the Impressionists.
Of course, most photographers and most painters will tell you that the golden light is the best light, which is typically the early morning light and the late afternoon light. But there are moments of golden light that last only a few seconds.
That's right.
That are sometimes the best golden light, oftentimes at a sunset. So how does one capture those moments of golden light? Is it about memory training? Because you literally have sometimes
15, 20 seconds,
Yeah.
a minute,
Minute?
yeah.
Yeah.
It can pass so quickly. I know that the memory training was a huge component of a lot of the French schools in the late 1800s. A lot of the tonalists studied both either in Munich or in Paris, where that kind of training was important in the promulgated by the instructors. So I think that was an important part of it too. I think a lot of it was just living in the landscape. A lot of the tonalists painted plein air, but a lot of them created their larger paintings in the studio from memory, deliberately. They wanted the memory to influence how they saw things. So in a 5 minutes, you have 5 minutes of a sunset. I think it's fun to try and slapdash that down in a plein air painting. Often you're really limited to just color mixtures, which I think is perfectly appropriate. Why not? Because the camera can't capture. A quick sketch, I do think that's where a camera sometimes can come in very handy, capturing those ephemeral moments, even though you have to understand that it's not going to capture the color, and it often exaggerates the value contrast. But at least it captures detail and form that then you can take a couple quick shots and then sit down with your sketchbook and make color notes, anything you can do to put that in your head so you can go back into the studio and paint it. I know with George Inness, especially later in his life, all his paintings were creations. He just pulled them out of his head. He had spent so much time painting plein air and studying nature that he was able to do that toward the end of his life. They were all inventions.
So if your intent was to do a sunset painting, for instance, in plein air, would you go in and lay out kind of the basic drawing elements and so on, and then wait till that 5 minute period of time to put your color in?
Well, I can remember clearly 3 years ago or 4 in the Adirondacks, sitting on the beach near Paul Smith's with a group, spectacular sunset, and I think I did maybe 4 or 5 paintings in 45 minutes, not one of which, of course, would end up in a gallery. They weren't finished paintings. It was the experience and fun, but I think that the advantage of that is you don't have time to fuss. You take a large brush, you block in the color and values as quickly as you can and as accurately you can, and it's a little bit like downhill skiing on a 3-diamond trail when you're really trained to be on the bunny slopes. It is an exhilarating and terrifying time to paint, but it's a lot of fun, and sometimes that's the only way you can capture it. I do think doing that, it's going to burn it into your memory, and coupled with those sketches and coupled with maybe a couple good photographs can lead to a successful painting in the studio.
Yeah, well, the problem, of course, with photographs is that when you're photographing a sunset, you can never get it right, because photographs, typically cameras average out the entire scene, which means the sky is different from the foreground.
That's right.
And so you can manipulate a photograph, but it's never as accurate or brilliant as what you see.
Never.
As a matter of fact, the Hudson River School painters were criticized for their bright Adirondack sunsets because nobody believed that could actually be true. They thought they had exaggerated them, and if anything, they were probably under-exaggerated.
That's right. They were accurate. Yeah, interesting.
It's just so colorful.
Yeah.
So let's go back just a step. Tell me about early days, interest in art. What got you excited about becoming an artist, becoming an illustrator?
I think like so many artists, I always drew. I was the kid whose margins of my books in grade school, frankly, I wish I'd kept some of them. I would draw scenes from Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, if you remember that old, one of my favorite programs. So there were little submarines, and I went through all those phases. Into high school, I got more serious. I was actually taking art classes at our local, they called it the Lafayette Museum of Art in Lafayette, Indiana. Figure drawing classes in high school, and would often spend in the summer, do pen and ink drawings, set up a still life in our living room of a little flowers and do drawings. I knew it by the time I was in high school that I was terrible at math and I loved art. And it seemed a natural then to study art. My parents were very supportive. I was so fortunate for that. Although my father did both of them made the stipulation that I go to a university and get a rounded, more liberal arts education than just art. I could major in art, but they wanted me to be a little more rounded. I'm of both minds of that today. I have friends who left high school and studied in Florence for 2 years, and boy, that sounds like a great way to jump into the art world. I have really no regrets. And then I went to graduate school in painting and drawing, studied etching in France for 7 months, which was wonderful. Decided at the end that I didn't want to be a printmaker because the process took so much time that all the ideas were backing up, but it was all good experience.
Well, let me just stop you right there, because you said two things I want to know more about. You studied printmaking in France. I want to know more about that. And you also talked before that about the school, but you didn't mention where you went.
Oh, I went to Washington University in St. Louis.
Okay.
They had a very strong, I'll start with that maybe. They had a very strong art program. They had a very successful illustration program. At the time, they'd produced 2 or 3 of the real top names, of Bernie Fuchs and of course, I'm totally blank. Even Mike Peters, the political cartoonist, who's quite well known, came out of WashU's illustration program. At the time, and nothing against them, because there's a lot of abstract work I love, but the faculty, painting faculty, were entirely abstract expressionists. I wanted to learn how to paint light and form, and that wasn't their thing. So I ended up studying illustration, because the illustration instructors, that's what it was all about. They would teach you how to do a portrait and how to do a still life and how to do a landscape. So I was a illustration major. And then following college, went to France. I love the etching. I love the graphic quality of the black and white work. But I was taught in a school that was very traditional, where we bought the copper plates and we spent a day polishing the plate. And then you would mix the wax, the varnishes. And I found that I was, meanwhile, walking the streets of Avignon with a sketchbook, coming upon scene after scene that I wanted to translate into an etching. But the process, it took me a week to do one etching. And by that time, I had 10 sketches I wanted to do. And by the second week, I had 30 sketches. I realized I was never going to catch up with this. So it was just a lesson that at that point, I realized the process was so time-consuming. It was just not for me.
So was there an etching school that you attended?
It was a professional, a woman who ran her own atelier, and she would do work, take outside assignments to do work, and produce her own work, and she just took on students. It was very small, but a wonderful experience. But then I came back and went back to grad school for drawing and painting. I always had known that at that time I was still painting, but starting as a freelance illustrator. And I knew that I wanted my foot in both. And as my illustration career took off and it became fairly successful, I was actually able to help send our boys to college with it. I realized that illustration paid the bills, but painting fed the soul. And I needed both. At that time in my life, I needed both. I felt too that the illustration, I had friends who were painters who were unable to support themselves, so they waited tables. I decided that I would rather spend that time drawing as an illustrator that would increase my drawing skills. So looking back, I have no regrets of the portion of my life I've spent as an illustrator. For that very reason, it really fine-tuned my drawing skills, which I think now have come to help with my painting.
Well, the illustration business completely changed right about the time you were kind of winding down that part of your career and moving more into painting.
I was so fortunate.
The
timing was perfect. I remember, I remember at one point in the early 2000s, maybe it was the late 1990s, I was so busy that within 1 week I turned down a job from the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. News and World Report, and I think the Los Angeles Times, and I knew at that moment I'd made it. That if I could afford to turn some fairly big clients down, and they were fine with it because they knew I was busy. So at that point I was working and frankly doing very little painting. I was just so busy. I had 5 or 6 jobs a week. I was working 6 days a week. I would take Sundays off, and often working 12 or 14-hour days. I knew I had to pay my dues, and I think that went on for 2 years until my wife had a talk with me. And then we started taking the weekends off together, which was great. But I think it was in the mid-2000s that my heart wasn't in it anymore. The industry had changed quite a bit. Deadlines became tighter. The pay continued to drop. And it just didn't feel the same. And I think that by that time, too, I was probably in my late 40s, I guess it would have been late 40s. I was looking forward to just painting again and really getting back into painting in a very serious way. In 2008, when the market crashed there, what few illustration jobs I had completely disappeared. So I was very fortunate. I was ready to get out of illustration just at the time that the industry suffered a severe setback in 2008. Magazines, I think within 1 year, 5 of my magazine clients went out of business. Newspapers could no longer afford my prices for illustrations, so the phone stopped ringing. And I was fortunately in a position that I was able to just transition right into painting full time. Of course, that meant getting my painting skills up to snuff. And I look back at my work that I was doing 15 years ago and was astonished how poor it looks by today. But
so what does that process look like? You make a conscious decision that you're going to become a full-time painter. Now you've got a whole different set of pressures, because you not only have to get your painting up to snuff, you have to get your paintings out there, you have to get into the market, so to speak.
That's right.
What was that process like for you of getting your paintings up to snuff and then getting them to the point where you could make a living?
Well, I think that both of those cases were addressed by what I learned as an illustrator. When I first started in illustration, I produced what I thought were my best 8 pieces of work, all different media, all different subjects, and at great expense I sent out 400 pieces to art directors, and I got absolutely 0 responses. So I thought, I'm not doing this right. So I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought a book that just happened to be out, Marketing and Business Skills for Illustrators, and absolutely devoured it. And 4 months later, I had identified my style that I wanted, I identified the market I wanted to advertise to, and within 6 months, I was busy. So I learned the lesson that you have to market, that it's not going to happen accidentally. I think a lot of when I was young, thought, no, let the quality of my work speak for itself. That's true. The quality speaks at a certain level, but there are a lot of beautifully talented artists who are still, having to struggle to put food on the table. You have to market. So I learned that from illustration. In terms of getting my skills up to snuff, I think it was the work ethic from illustration that it just became very normal for me to go into the studio at 7 in the morning and leave at 5 o'clock at night and just work and work.
You have to treat it like a job.
It is, and it was a job, but it didn't feel like a job because I
love doing it.
I loved it. Yeah.
But I think this is one of the problems that a lot of painters struggle with, is that they're trying to get their careers on fire, they're trying to launch their careers, but they're not spending any time in marketing, which is why we're doing a lot of marketing training.
That's right.
But they're also easily distracted. What I tell them is, look, you've got to go in there. If you moved from your full-time job as a dental hygienist or a doctor or a lawyer or whatever you were doing, you have to take that same amount of time, or probably more, and get in there and be disciplined and apply it to your work. Get
right.
in there. Don't mess around in the morning. Just get to work and work all day.
That's huge. And I know you'd agree with this. Eric Maisel, who's the founder of Creativity Coaching and has put out some wonderful books for artists, he once said something that I know you have often alluded to in the talks, and I listened to your art marketing boot camp. If anything that supports your work is part of your work. So marketing can be such an important part of your career as a painter that it is as important as painting. Because without the marketing, there are going to be no galleries, no sales, and then you may not be able to afford to paint. So anything that supports your work is part of your work. It's part of the job.
Well, it's kind of like it's the gas to the car.
That's right. That's right.
You absolutely
That's a good analogy.
have to have
Yeah, it really is. So I think for me, when I was starting, I thought, well, if it worked as an illustrator to buy a book, at that time I bought a book about marketing for artists, and what was it, The Artist's Guide to Galleries, or those big thick books that used to come out in the late 90s. I bought one of those and approached some galleries. You learn very quickly that, and I think, again, because of the illustration, knowing that I needed to have a work that was identifiably me, and that I needed to identify that market. So I quickly learned, too, what galleries may accept my work and what wouldn't. I didn't bother approaching a gallery that was full of abstract expressionists. I was looking for someone that sold landscapes, but maybe not having too many artists that, of similar work, et cetera, et cetera. So I was, even though I didn't like it, and I've never liked marketing, it's just, I think most artists don't, but I realized this is something I have to do. It's an important part of the work. And in terms of getting into the studio, you just have to paint. You have to paint. And I think, though, that What I used to do as an illustrator that I found so helpful is every 6 months and I'd never let a year go by without doing this. I would pull out my 10 most successful illustrations and I would lay them on the floor. And I would look at them for probably an hour and make a list of what I thought really worked in each one, found out what they had in common. And then I thought, well, if by focusing on such and such, the composition or the way I position things or the way I'm handling the color, if that's leading to all these successful illustrations, why don't I do that in all my work? And then I would do the next day I would do the opposite. I'd pull out my 10, what I considered my worst pieces, and I'd say, what do these have in common that is killing them? And then I'd try to avoid that. And I carried that over a little bit in my paintings. So I think that when I was beginning 15 years ago and really struggling, I was struggling with the materials, struggling with the concepts, but I was hoping I could get to the point where I could paint the way I had always wanted to and express what I wanted to express. I went through the same process. I think also being an illustrator taught me to separate my ego from the work. I can't tell you the number of times I would do an illustration and I'd send it off to the client, skipping with joy, knowing I was going to get a call in 20 minutes from the art director saying, wow, you nailed it. This is a home run. We love it. And instead they would say, we don't like it. The client doesn't like it. You need to change this, this, and this. And you know, I could hear the air of the balloon of my ego going shh. You know, and then there were times when I would do a piece, tight deadline. I had to make the deadline, and I was ashamed of it. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never going to hear from this client again. And they would call and they say, oh, we love it. The client loves it. We want you to do 15 more just like this. So I learned quickly that I can't really judge my own work. And if you let your ego get attached to work, you'll never learn from your mistakes, your failures.
I think that's a really critical point for everybody. It's an aha moment, really, because we're all too close to it.
Absolutely.
I visited a gallery that I'm in, and they had an old painting that I had painted 10 years earlier, and it was hanging up there. It hadn't sold. And there was this woman who was a collector who kind of spends a lot of time at that gallery. And I was cringing when I walked up the stairs and I saw this painting. I was cringing. It's like, oh, I hate that painting. And I was about ready to say something about it because I was almost apologetic, right? And I was about ready to say something. And this woman says to me, you know, this is my favorite painting of yours that I've ever done. And I'm just saving my money so that I can own this piece.
Yeah,
and I was about to go, you know, what a horrible painting.
Yeah.
And so I think that the problem is that we can't see our own work. So how do you know when you're good? How do you know when a painting is good? So you're trying to elevate your work, and you can't see it yourself. You can't always see what works, especially in the beginning when you don't have sales, when you haven't had a gallery. Is there a tool, a way to find out? Is it going to other people to get insights? How did you do it?
Let me first go back to because you said you don't know if you're good or the painting is good. And let me just quickly separate these two. I don't think it's helpful to worry about whether other artists think I'm good or the world, frankly, because I can't judge. I don't know. I also think then that ultimately, it's not that that's unimportant, but ultimately that leads too often, if I'm thinking that, oh my gosh, I'm not good measured against all other artists, that puts a lot of pressure on yourself. It's going to trigger the negative, that judge in our mind that just loves to trash us. You should have gone to business school. You never should have tried to be an art major. That's not helpful. But to know whether this or not this specific painting is good or not can be very helpful information. I think as I look back, I wouldn't call it a mistake. I would probably change it if I could go back, but I, for some reason, just always felt like I needed to figure this out myself. So between grad school and say where I am, certainly where I am now, I've taken I've taken workshops, but very few. I always, felt like it wasn't that I didn't need to go to other artists as much as it just never occurred to me that I could ask for help. I have felt that I have to figure this out. So for me, I often would compare my work to the masters, Monets, the Inneses, the Sargents, and say, well, I can see clearly that I don't have the brushwork of Sargent, I don't understand the color like Monet, and I don't understand composition or value like Innes. So I would just study them, and then go out and just keep painting. and always comparing a successful painting of mine to an unsuccessful, and trying to learn again, what did I do here that worked, and again comparing it with other artists. Then later, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I started to really pay attention to what other artists were doing. I had always up to that point focused really on the great old masters, and I would often run into an art magazines, a plein air magazine, and I would be attracted to, wow, that's a killer painting, or, well, I don't know about that painting. I never bothered to follow specific artists. I never really paid much attention to what was going on in this country today in plein air painting, landscape painting. That dramatically changed everything, and it has been so helpful. Connecting with other artists, I now have I've become friends with just some terrific artists who have no compunction at all about saying, that sky's not working in that painting. I love that kind of criticism because I know from who it's coming from, they know exactly what's not working and they can help me see it. So I think that, yes, talking to other artists, looking at magazines, Plein Air Magazine is a wealth of a range of talents, and it, again, though, it's one of those things that you can learn from someone who's a beginner as much as you can from a master, just by listening to what they're saying and often being reminded of, oh, yes, I've been overlooking that. That's interesting what this so-called beginner said. So,
well, one of the values of an event like going to the Plein Air Convention or going to the Adirondacks or Fall Color Week or one of those events we do is when you're around 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 other artists, and you may be painting in the same place. As you know, in the Adirondacks, we typically go to this one scene that we all paint together, and there's a row of 100 artists that are lined up, and yet if you walk from painting to painting, nobody's doing the same thing. Nobody's doing the same scene. One person is focusing in on a lily pad, another person is focusing on the peak of a mountain. And what it does by being around others is it opens your eyes to other possibilities that you hadn't thought of. The danger in all of that is, of course, is to go back to your painting and scrape it off and change it and go for something different.
Feel that you have to adopt somebody else's style rather than staying true to yourself?
That's right. Yeah. And one of the things I now try to avoid, you probably do the same thing, is if I'm painting with other people, I don't even want to walk over and look at what they're painting, because all of a sudden I'll be, oh, I should have done that in the sky, and start playing with that. You just have to kind of be true to yourself.
You do.
You said something else that I think is a really important aha moment for a lot of people, and that is the idea of magazines and books and really museums. So museums are your friends, and I find that the artists who seem to be the most successful, the ones who are embraced most by collectors, the ones who are financially the most successful, I find that they spend a lot of time in museums. I see that these people will get on an airplane and go to a show. When the Sorolla exhibit was in America, they'd get on an airplane and fly across the country to go see that show and to study those paintings. I find that the artists that have the most success are the ones that are going to the museums more frequently, and they return to the masters.
That's right.
And they're, in many cases, they're getting permission to go and copy them on location. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think that for me, it was an absolute revelation to see in both Monet and Innes, I think, were huge influences on me when I was young. And it's one thing to study even the most beautiful reproductions, but to study the paintings themselves, to study the surfaces and comparing the two artists. I think of Monet, and where I live in Williamstown, Massachusetts, we're just gifted with the Clark Museum, small museum that has one of Monet's cathedrals and a wonderful Impressionist collection, and also has 9 Inneses. So I'm so lucky to be able to a quick aside, there was one time I was out in a field painting, struggling with the edge of a tree line against the sky, and it was driving me crazy. I dropped everything, left my easel sitting in the field, got in the car and drove into the Clark because I knew they had a Corot that was just essentially almost the same scene. And I ran up and looked at the painting, made a couple notes, and I was back in the field painting. I wanted to see how he did it. So that's purely a good fortune of having that kind of easy access. But to see the surfaces especially, I think for both Innes and Monet, I had no idea that when you're young and just accustomed to seeing these little reproductions, that these paintings, it isn't the size of them, it's the looseness, the roughness of the handling of the paint. And it's so clear that they were caught up in the joy of the process and they weren't fiddling with it. You know, it's clear that they just weren't uptight about every brushstroke. There's a certain energy and a getting lost in the process that comes through in the surfaces of their painting. So I think for me, often when I go seeing Sorolla's murals in the Hispanic Society in New York was a revelation. 20 feet by 40 feet. It looks like he was painting these things with a 6-inch house brush.
He almost had to.
And they're so loosely done. And I realized he's not sweating the details. He's lost in the moment the joy of painting, certainly, but there was absolute, method to his madness. There's an energy in the painting and a confidence that I think you just would never get from looking at a reproduction.
Well, you can usually get the answers from the paintings. Mm-hmm. But
you can.
If you could sit down with one of those artists from the past, maybe George Ennis, what question would you ask him?
That's a great. Maybe I'd first ask him how he reacts when he totally screws up a painting that he thought was going to be a success, a 30 by 40, And I know his attitude was, this isn't working. I'll just try something else. I would love to have gotten into his head about the way he composes his scenes and his value structure. There are several paintings I've seen of his in which I think they presage they're so far ahead of their time. The composition is so abstract, and I'm such a huge advocate of painting and of identifying the basic value structure of a scene, those 2 to 5 values, that light sky, dark fields, because I see that in great painting after great painting. Contemporary painters, the old masters, those who really can produce a stunning landscape, always, you can see they have analyzed that value structure and nailed it. They've got it down. Ennis's values are all over the map. He'll have black in the clouds and a bright streak here, and yet he pulls it off. I think that, frankly, if I could rephrase or maybe not directly answer your question, I wouldn't ask him anything. I would ask if I could sit and watch him paint for 10 hours. Yeah. That's what I'd like to see. I want to see how he does this, because they say he painted with his fingers. He would use glazes and scumblings and washes and then scrape. Or one of the great tonalist, probably my second favorite tonalist, is J. Francis Murphy, who would often use scraping as part of his process. Now, I scrape usually out of frustration. I scrape when the painting's not working. And often I'm finding now that leaving some of that on and repainting can create interesting things. But he would actually scrape as a deliberate part of his process. That I would love to see how he worked that. There's so much to learn, so much to learn.
Yeah, and so little time.
In so little time, yeah.
So, I think one of the things that is really important to communicate to people who might be new painters or might be watching this is don't get so invested in your work.
Oh, God. I mean, love painting, but don't get invested in the painting. The one you're working on at the moment is put your heart and soul into it. It's your only child. But in reality, you have 10,000 children there in the background waiting. And if this one doesn't work, kick it out the door. I mean, it's done. If this turns out to be the miscreant you wish you hadn't raised, it's time to let go. So put your heart and soul in every painting. But if it's not working, you have to be willing to just not take it personally and learn from it. Don't get rid of it until you stop and think about what you did. Because if you don't do that, I mean, when you think about a failed painting, they are our best teachers. And in the most concrete terms, they're showing us where we need to work. If your paintings are not working, and you're so embarrassed by that or feel uncomfortable that you just shove them against the wall and don't want to see them and then quickly paint over them, you're really losing some incredible instruction, free instruction right there leaning against your wall. Put the painting up and ask yourself, is it the composition that's not working? Is it the value structure? Is it the way that I'm mixing greens? Our mistakes are screaming at us, and if we don't listen to them, we're not going to improve. I think that became a huge part of my process about 15 years ago. And I think that I could see the quality of my work slowly get better and better, where instead of, if I had a painting that didn't work, I just would let it go. But before I destroyed it, I would look at that painting and I'd go through a list. Is it the composition? Is it what? I had to know what's not working. Because it's telling me, it's right there in front of me. In the most concrete way, it's showing my flaws as a painter. I need to identify those, or I'm not going to know what to work on.
And if you can't see it, put it down.
Wait a year.
Aside.
Yeah, wait a
Wait a year.
Yeah, wait a year. The mistakes are still there. Yeah,
They'll jump out at you.
Yeah, it'll jump out at you.
Well, you know, I hear stories of friends taking all their old panels and burning them, you know, because they don't want them in the market if something happens to them. And at the same time, I go through my old panels about once every 2 years, hundreds of them. And I look at them and I learn, first off, it's nice to be able to look back. You know, we in our culture, we tend to always look forward to see what's ahead. But if we turn around and we look back and see what we've accomplished, then, you know, there's not so much pressure.
Yes.
And so to go back through your panels, it gives you encouragement because you see what you've accomplished, you see how much you've grown, but you also can see mistakes that you couldn't see back then when you painted them that you may have only learned this particular year.
Yeah, this week. Yeah, that's right. No, it's absolutely, yeah, that's right.
I've had moments where I've been totally frustrated by a painting and I've taken a bunch of just black paint and just out of anger, you know, gone over it, and then realizing, gee, this was stupid, and then I wipe it down, and I ended up with one painting ended up with this wonderful highlight inside the texture of the brush strokes, and it just made the whole thing come alive, and that unified color, in spite of the fact that it's, you know, it tied it all together. And I knew a painter who once used to do that. He would, after he did everything, he glazed with a color that unified everything. Do you ever do anything like that?
I do that all the time. In fact, I even now jokingly refer to it as creative destruction. So if I have a painting that's not working, you know, 5 years ago, I would, after breaking 3 brushes, you know, and cursing my poor luck of having no talent, then I would just scrape it. You know, I'd scrape the whole thing and set it against the wall. Now, instead, if I really decide that I've learned what I need to from this painting, you know, I messed up the composition. Okay, I might as well stop right now. But instead, what I'll often do is take a roll of paper towels and simply wipe maybe the sky and then wipe paint off some of the, trying to keep the major value shapes together. Yeah. And then if that doesn't bring the painting together, and often it can, what I'm finding it often does is it brings, if I have too many value variations in these shapes, it'll bring those values together. It eliminates all the details, so I'm no longer distracted by that. It will, by wiping certain areas, tie the colors together. I'm essentially blending the colors. And if that doesn't quite bring it back, then I'll start to wipe more. And I'm finding that usually with about each layer of wiping reveals a different painting. And sometimes, and it happens, I don't know, maybe 1 out of 4 or 5 times, I'll be able to take that back to a stage that I say, there's a good painting in there. And I'll go back and rework the painting and sure enough end up with a successful painting. So it's so important not to despair, not to give in to despair. and simply say, okay, what did I do wrong? Identify that, but then, scrape the painting, put a single color over it, wipe it. You have nothing to lose but a mediocre painting, which is nothing to lose.
So as a painter, what do you think is the most important lesson you ever learned, and who did you learn it from?
Wow. Strangely enough, I would say the most important lesson that maybe was a turning point in my realizing that this is something I can learn and I can do this was about 20 years ago from Cézanne, who I read, and it may be apocryphal, or I may have been mistaken, but I seem to have read someplace where he would take 1 or 2 brush strokes and clean his brush, step back and look, 1 or 2 brush strokes. And like John Singer Sargent, whose paintings look as if they were painted in a virtuosic frenzy, and they said that wasn't how they were painted at all. He actually was very deliberate with a brush stroke. He'd go back and look at it and then scrape it and then do it again. From Cézanne, from Sargent, I learned to slow down. And I saw the quality of my work take a substantial leap forward within a couple weeks just by, instead of, as I used to do, paint for 10 or 15 minutes because it's so much fun and oh, this is great and I just love this. And then I'd finally step back and I think, whoa, there are 10 mistakes in here and they're all interacting with each other. I simply decided to slow down. So now I will take no more than, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 brush strokes, paint for 15, 20 seconds, step back, 15, 20 seconds, step back. I found actually my productivity go up because I was making so fewer mistakes that were fatal to the painting. I caught mistakes early, and then I could see one mistake that would jump out rather than so many mistakes in the canvas that I couldn't tell what was good and what wasn't good.
Well, they say Sargent wore out the carpet because he stepped back so much.
Exactly.
Well, one trick that I've learned is that sometimes I'll put the paper towel in the back, so that every time I need to wipe out my brushes, I have to walk to get a new piece of paper towel because I forget to step back.
It's huge. We can slow down. We don't get points for being first to finish. You don't. And I think it's particularly difficult painting plein air. When the scene, you know those colors are going to change in 20 minutes. Yes, then go to that area first just to get the color down. But I find myself having to, especially plein air, say slow down, slow down, slow down, because it's always better to end the day with an unfinished painting that's really working than a painting that's quote unquote finished that's a loss. Because you rushed it. You rushed it. Don't rush. There's no hurry. Yeah.
So for somebody who might be watching this and is early stage painter, just beginning, just learning, what's the best advice you can give them?
A beginner. Patience. Be patient. Think long term. These skills, you can develop these skills. Talent. One of my favorite quotes that I wish I could do, I don't know who said it, I wish I could attribute it to him or her, but in the long run, perseverance and talent are indistinguishable. In the long run, perseverance and talent are indistinguishable. So don't despair that you weren't born gifted with Sargent's, ability. I certainly wasn't. But through just steady work and tapping into the joy of painting, the fact that you want to do this, being willing to create a lot of bad paintings in the process and learning from them, patience, but do work that's meaningful for you. Because this endeavor is so, it takes so many years and decades to really begin to master all of this. And we produce bad paintings and we produce good paintings. We have good weeks, bad weeks. We have good years and bad years. And we all have had months on end where what is going on? I can't seem to make the right decisions. That can take its toll and can really destroy the joy and the passion that drives your painting. So if you're not doing meaningful work, and by that I mean if you haven't found that landscapes are your thing, or still lifes, or I want to do nothing but paint the figure for the rest of my life because it creates an energy and a passion in me that it seems not like it's not work. If you can't tap into that, you will not have the energy to get you through those low moments. And we all have lots of them. I will do 2 bad paintings a week. I'll have 2 bad weeks in a 6-month period, and I'll have 2 bad months in a 2-year period. And I know when I see them coming that I just got to gut it out. You just get through it.
Well, you also have to remember that with the dark clouds comes the rain exactly. That renourishes. And one thing that painters oftentimes don't realize is the bad is good.
That's right.
That when you're going through the bad, it's actually pushing you to a new level. Usually, if a painter wants to go from here to here, there's that period of storm in between. Peter Drucker talks about it in business, and it's true in all things because you're pushing yourself, and what it does is it's challenging you. So look at the bad as something you have to go through rather than letting your ego get in the way.
Absolutely, and I always think of it as a circle. If in the center is our expertise, and on the edge is the unknown, by definition, trying something new, learning something, means we don't know how to do it, or it wouldn't be learning. Well, when we don't know how to do something and we're on the edge of our knowledge zone, we're also on the edge of our comfort zone. And it doesn't feel good to make mistakes and be frustrated week after week if you're trying something new. But we have to just understand that's part of the process. Because if we only did things that made us feel good, if we only work continually from our strengths, we're going to be doing the same paintings in 20 years as we're doing right now. That's right. And what's the point of that? Yeah. I think that often getting accustomed to, we never have to like that discomfort, of being on the edge of out of our comfort zone, of failing, and again, I always consider it like free falling. I feel like I'm free falling. I don't know what the heck I'm doing, and this painting is crashing down, and it's so frustrating. And at that moment, I at least can stop and say, boy, I'm in a good spot. This is rich, because this is where I need to be if I'm going to learn anything. I have to get accustomed to feeling those feelings of discomfort when we're out of our comfort zone. That's what learning is about. It's part of it. It's part of it. Can't avoid it.
So what have we not talked about that we should talk about?
The current state of the art market. Yeah.
That'll change. It'll ebb and flow.
The state of landscape painting. I've begun thinking more and more that landscape painting, especially plein air landscape painting, is one of the most radical things we could be doing right now as artists in this day and age. And you think, oh, radical art are those crazy things, the really, really far out things that you see Sotheby's selling for $50 million, or you see at Mass MoCA, where I live, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. And again, not to criticize those artists. There's room enough in art for everything. It's a huge field. It can accommodate everything. But I think that we as plein air landscape artists, or as landscape artists, don't appreciate often enough. In our current time and culture, I think we're actually rather radical. To paint on location means that we're more concerned with experiencing this beautiful environment of ours, which is endangered, and celebrate the beauty of that. I think in general to paint landscapes is to celebrate our connection with the earth, to celebrate beauty, which I think in the contemporary arts circles is looked at as with a little, bit of an askance eye. Can seem awfully naive. We're representational artists. I think that at this time in art history, where what is considered the cutting edge of art is so opposite from where we are, I almost feel like we've come full circle. And we are doing what I think is pretty radical, going back to the past and really connecting with a lot of that.
Historically, that's always what happens, is what becomes radical then goes out of style and something else new comes in style, and sometimes it's something from the past. This is a very interesting observation that you've made, because the plein air movement is the largest movement today in the history of art, ever. There always were plein air painters, at least going back as far as Constable and probably a little further back than that. But there weren't large groups of people who painted. Probably the largest group of plein air painters back was when the Impressionists were painting together, and there were 5 or 6 of them. And then there were some small groups of people, Willard Metcalf painting in Connecticut, and there were some small groups of people there, and there were some small groups of people in California. But today, there are more people painting in plein air than together. I mean, if you think about the plein air convention, the most recent one, which had 1,000 painters in one location painting in San Diego, it was a phenomenon.
Yeah, that's unique in the history of art. It really is. Yeah.
And you look at the number of people who are plein air painters. Some are professionals, some are midway there, some are amateurs. None of that matters. What matters is that they're enriching their souls, they're enriching their lives, they're expressing themselves creatively. They have this community where they're together as a whole. And to be a part of that is magnificent. And people will look back on this time. Jean Stern, who's an art historian at the Irvine Museum, says that this may be the most important art movement in the history of art, because there's so many people plein air painting.
I can believe it. And I think part of that too is what I consider the deprofessionalization of painting. As someone who considers myself a professional artist, it's what I do for a living, and I make my income off of it. I'm aware, though, that too often professionals in the field, whether they want to or not, because of their very expertise, can serve as a deterrent for beginners to even pick it up and try it. We live in a culture that's so focused on success that only if you succeed does it matter what you did. And always the focus is on the outcome, forgetting that the process of just painting, someone who is a joyful painter as a beginner, what I experience painting and what they experience is absolutely identical. That joy knows no hierarchy. That passion knows no hierarchy. And I think that what I've seen, this plein air movement, is it's giving permission, an overused cliche, but it's giving permission to people to be beginners again and to pick up and enjoy something in the moment, the process while they're doing it, and not compare themselves incessantly to the so-called masters at the top of the field. Because so much through history has been, oh, you know, the Monets, we worship the Monets and the Sargents, but how many times have that worshiping them has discouraged people from picking up a brush and trying it? Oh, I could never draw, I could never paint. And in reality, you can. And with very little instruction, you can come up to a very simple level of competence that can give you great joy. That's one of the other attributes of this whole great plein air movement that I think is just absolutely terrific. It's getting people on the streets and saying, you have a creative birthright, and you have a right as just a human being to go out and experience your own creative prowess. Do it, just do it.
And my plein air studies are my most valued possession other than my family. And I won't sell my plein air studies because I can look at that painting and relive the moment when a deer went leaping through the woods, or you know, when there was something going on, freezing cold out painting the windmills in Holland. And so those are things that people can experience in their lives, and that it enriches their lives. I think with all movements, you know, there's always an old guard. Mm-hmm. And the old guard doesn't want anything to change. And the old guard in the plein air movement doesn't like the fact that there are all these people coming into it and all these people learning to paint, because their attitude is, well, this is going to dilute the marketplace, this is going to make the cost of paintings go down, this is going to put, you know, new competition. And some of those things are true, and we have to be careful about that. That's why I'm constantly pushing quality, that everybody needs to pursue quality with vigor, that they have to really go out and try to always elevate themselves, because we don't want plein air painting to mean bad painting.
That's right.
We want plein air painting to mean this is something you've done on location. It's something that it doesn't have to be a finished painting. But most of the people who are doing this are never going to be professionals. They're never going to sell a gallery. They're people who just want the joy of being out there, enjoying nature. Maybe they're not golfers, maybe they're not people who hike, but they're people who love to be outdoors, and they're creative, and they want to get their expression onto that canvas. And that's a special thing.
That is a special thing. And I would even, in terms of the market, I would counter that to have these plein air events in all the different towns and cities across the country, you are exposing to everyone in that town painting and what it means in the process, and inciting curiosity, and chances are you're creating a market. You are creating future buyers of those paintings, if not the onlookers, even though the beginner painters, those who try it and maybe continue to paint and never get in a gallery, but odds are they will themselves become a collector later. So I don't see any downsides.
There's no downside. You know, when we started Plein Air Magazine, there were probably not 5 plein air events across America. Today there are hundreds of events that are attracting people from the local community who are going home and putting original art into their homes instead of posters or reproductions.
Right.
And you know, as I've been to your studio, I know that when you're surrounded by original artwork, it completely changes the nature of your environment. And so we're enriching lives for other people, and some of them are interested and they want to learn how to do it. It's amazing to me how many collectors are now becoming plein air painters because they have gone to these events and somebody has done a workshop and they've been inspired. And so it's making everything better, I think.
I think so too. These are skills that can be learned. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fabulous time together. I'm really excited about what I've learned from you, and I'm very complimentary of what you've done. I'm a big fan of your artwork, and I think that we're all going to grow by observing what you do.
Well, thank you. I'm still learning a lot. So much to learn. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, that is John MacDonald, creating dynamic landscapes. And you can learn more about the full-length video at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, we have a special discount code for you today only, and it is in the comments section. I want to remind you guys that we have a free video called 97 Amazing Painting Secrets from the World's Top Artists. You can learn more about it and get it for free at 97tips.com. Hey, Christmas Eve. I want to thank you guys for watching us all year throughout coronavirus. I hope you're okay. Hope you have a really terrific Christmas. We'll be here tomorrow, but you don't have to be. but if you are, we'll see you then. Thanks for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.
Paintings, when done well, create an emotional response. The goal of a painter should be to create a landscape that transports the viewer into the scene, where it evokes deep feelings and emotions. If you paint a snow scene, your viewer should shiver and feel the cold blowing snow. A beach scene should let the viewer feel the warmth of the sun, the sound of the crashing waves, and the sand between their toes. A forest creek should have your viewers experiencing the peace of the woods, their hands reaching into the cool water, and hearing the sounds of a trickling stream. To paint emotional landscapes, it's important to study from a master landscape artist who has conquered the nuances of light, the energy of the foliage, and the perfect balance of color to create an atmosphere where you can tell the temperature just by looking at the scene. Nowhere will you find that sort of master instruction than with John MacDonald, one of the most successful and prominent artists in North America, and one of the world's great teachers.
I am not going to be offering you any secrets, any special techniques known only the chosen few, any secret formulas that'll make your paintings glow like a vermeer. I'm a firm believer in the basics, and I think that you will find that your painting will improve the more you can focus on and master and come to a deeper understanding of the basics: composition, value, color, edges, etc.
You'll discover incredible insights, which are the important keys to mastering any art form.
It's value, not color, that creates the illusion of space. It's value, not color, that creates the illusion of light. And it's value that creates the illusion of form. If you can solve all of those issues just on an underpainting, it will make the addition of color much easier. In part two, because value is a component of color.
Don't be misled. While this course focuses on the basic elements of painting, which beginners will certainly benefit from, each element is covered in such depth that even experienced painters will benefit from it. In fact, many of the world's leading artists seek out instruction from John to help them elevate their paintings to a higher level.
Color luminosity you create by two different colors, warm, cool, keeping them exactly the same value. Well, you can get that essentially in one brushstroke.
You'll find the insights in this video incredibly unique. John MacDonald is a painter's painter, and one who will elevate your own overall skills by demonstrating these important principles and showing how to make such emotionally appealing and sublime paintings.
Painting is not a spectator sport. We can't sit back and just watch and listen or look. Yes, we can learn a lot from books, we can learn a lot from magazines, attending conventions, attending workshops, and talking to other artists. But ultimately, we learn to paint by painting. It's the only way we can really learn.
Creating Dynamic Landscapes on DVD and streaming video.